China, the world's second largest economy. Whenever the relationship between China's economy and developing countries is mentioned, people often think of the lending strategy that Beijing has extensively implemented over the past 15 years. A strategy that has been criticized multiple times by global media and labeled as debt trap diplomacy. Admittedly, few topics are more controversial than discussing a China that has poured hundreds of billions of dollars into poor developing nations. At first glance, it seems like a straightforward, mutually beneficial strategy. But from the perspective of many international experts and observers, there are significant questions surrounding these loans from China. And here I am, Mason. Wherever there's Mason, there's an easy-to-digest analysis of socioeconomic issues. Before diving into the main content, please note that this video is compiled by me and my team from various sources, so feel free to add your comments and suggestions below if there's anything to supplement. Now let's get back to the story. What's noteworthy is that over the years, China has continuously expanded its influence through substantial loans to smaller countries. Initially, this strategy indeed benefited China, not only by enhancing its political influence, but also by creating an extensive network of trade partners. China has become an alternative to the West in providing investment capital for infrastructure projects in developing countries. Roads, ports, airports, and power plants emerging in poor nations serve as tangible evidence of China's strong presence. It seems that with every excavator, every bridge or railway built, China moves one step closer to its ambition of becoming a global economic and political superpower. However, over time, the so-called dream has gradually revealed its problems. Although these projects have produced impressive numbers in promoting China's image, the reality is far more complicated. Countries borrowing from China have begun to struggle with debt repayment, while projects funded by Chinese investments fail to deliver the expected economic returns. And now, not only does China face the possibility of being unable to recover its massive loans, but it also finds itself in a dilemma where the very debt trap it's set up becomes an obstacle to its ambitions. A question I know many viewers are pondering is whether, given the widespread economic difficulties globally, China will be able to reclaim the loans it has provided. To answer this question, we need to revisit the case of Sri Lanka. The story of Sri Lanka is a prime example of the challenges China is currently facing. This South Asian country has plunged into a severe debt crisis, with total foreign debt exceeding $38 billion, nearly 50% of its GDP. Of this, around 10% is owed to China. By early 2022, Sri Lanka was unable to repay nearly $7 billion in debt and was forced to suspend foreign debt payments while awaiting restructuring. As a result, the Sri Lankan government was overthrown in massive protests, leaving China at risk of losing the entire debt if Sri Lanka's new government fails to stabilize the economy. Unfortunately for China, this is not an isolated case. In addition to Sri Lanka, several other nations such as Pakistan, Kenya, and numerous African countries have yet to find viable solutions to their mounting debt problems. Consequently, China faces the risk of unrecovered debts, forcing it to extend repayment deadlines or reduce debt amounts to avoid widespread defaults. This not only weakens China's financial standing, but also creates a burden of bad debt within its domestic financial system, leading to negative repercussions for its economy and politics. Moreover, a study by economist Karen Rapp, currently chief economist at the World Bank, reveals that China's undisclosed loans to developing countries could account for up to 15% of those nations' GDP. While Western countries and international financial institutions largely focus their aid on social programs such as healthcare, education, and humanitarian efforts. China has channeled most of its loans into infrastructure projects. Although these projects were initially expected to generate high returns, the global economic downturn and declining demand have declined, turning these loans into burdens for the borrowing nations and putting pressure on China itself as it faces difficulties in recovering the debts. Let's pause here for a deeper analysis. Although these infrastructure projects, such as highways, ports, or power plants, were promoted as impressive and ambitious, it has become clear that they often fail to generate the significant income that was initially expected. High-speed railway projects in Kenya and Pakistan are prime examples. These railways were originally expected to boost trade, but they encountered issues during the implementation and ultimately did not deliver the economic benefits as anticipated. As a result, these large-scale projects, once seen as emblematic of China's capabilities, have now become sources of criticism for their quality and feasibility. Additionally, the fact that many of China's loans are secured against the natural resources of poor nations adds another layer of risk for China. When commodity prices drop, debt recovery becomes even more challenging. This is the point where China begins to realize that it cannot sustainably rely on loans as a means to expand its influence. The situation becomes even more complicated as many countries now seek to reduce their dependence on China. Nations like Malaysia and Pakistan have started renegotiating their loan agreements to lessen their reliance on Beijing. This not only damages China's credibility, but also hampers its ability to maintain its central role in financing global infrastructure projects. Meanwhile, diplomatic tensions arising from China's lending practices have started to spread, particularly in South Asia, where China once had significant influence. Instead of strengthening relationships as initially intended, these countries are now looking for alternative partners, such as the United States and international organizations, to free themselves from Beijing's sphere of influence. These diplomatic tensions not only weaken China's position, but also create opportunities for Western nations, and China's rivals, such as the US and the EU, have openly criticized China's debt trap diplomacy strategy. Increasingly, this approach is being viewed as a form of neocolonialism, where China uses debt to manipulate the economies and politics of poor nations. So, is China truly the loser in this race? The answer is undoubtedly more complex than the analysis presented above. While China faces numerous challenges, from unrecovered debts to declining political influence, the country remains steadfast in its belief in its strategy. In recent years, China has shifted its focus toward African nations, where it can still maintain influence and garner political support. The cancellation of debts and the commitment to provide an additional 360 billion yuan, approximately $50.7 billion, over the next 3 years to Africa are part of this strategy, aimed at reaffirming its role in a strategically critical region of the world. To understand this move, we need to examine African countries. In reality, Africa is becoming a hot spot in the global power competition between China and the US. While the approaches used by the US and the EU to engage with Africa are increasingly unpopular with these nations, China has wisely chosen to provide financial support to African countries. China understands that such actions not only foster good relations with Africa, but also create significant influence within international organizations like the United Nations, where the votes of African nations hold considerable weight. Therefore, this could be the real driving force behind the dream strategy China is pursuing. From the analysis of China's actions, it is evident that while its debt trap diplomacy may yield short-term gains in power and influence over other nations, the significant financial risks and damage to its international reputation when countries fail to repay their debts will impose immense pressure on China. This highlights that in international relations, rather than focusing solely on short-term benefits, long-term gains accompanied by sustainability and fairness are what nations should strive for. Returning to China, despite the significant challenges its strategy is facing, it appears that the country remains determined to continue pursuing its ambitions and is constantly adjusting its approach to maintain its global influence. Stay tuned for the next chapters of this story as time reveals the answers. If you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share to support Mason. See you in the next videos.